You know, one of the principal, if not the principal reason why, in my opinion, the Israel-Palestine dilemma has been so hard to solve is because fundamentally we are not dealing with a political problem, which most people think we are. We're dealing with a spiritual problem, a problem of identity. For example, some of you know, up until about 8 years ago, a little over 8 years ago, I was very supportive. I don't know if I would say gung-ho, but I was very supportive of Israel. Any criticism of Israel, I would deflect with a certain internal logic that is very common among Jewish people who feel attached to Israel, for whom Israel is part of their identity. A lot of my arguments, I just made up on the spot. So for example, in 2006, in July of 2006, you may remember, Hezbollah went into northern Israel and abducted, I think, 2 Israeli soldiers and killed 3. And the next day, Israel attacked Lebanon, and that was the start of the second, what's known as the Second Lebanon War. Now that happened 3 weeks after Gilad Shalit was captured on the Gaza border, Israel-Gaza border, by Hamas. I saw this combination of events happening so close together as part of an Arab conspiracy that proved to me that the Arabs were insane, that the Arabs and Muslims were insane because they would not stop, no matter what, until Israel was destroyed and the Jewish people were destroyed. Why would I believe such a ridiculous idea? I mean, why would I think that 1 billion Arabs, like that I know the thinking of 1 billion Arabs, right? But when you're brought up in a society, and I was not brought up as a Zionist, I was brought up in a Reform synagogue. I hardly ever heard the word Zionism. I knew what it was. I mean, I thought I knew what it was. I would have, if someone had asked me then, all the way up till 2006, what Zionism was, I would have said, oh, it's just a movement to protect the Jewish people and to establish a Jewish homeland. That's it. And I would have thought that for all the Zionist leaders, that was their motive. And of course, for my parents and grandparents and their generations, every Jew I knew, that's what they thought. They didn't know what was really going on in the minds of these clever Zionists. But anyway, so Hezbollah attacks Israel. Israel then invades Lebanon, and the Second Lebanon War starts. And Israel is destroying the country. And friends of mine are telling me that Israel is using disproportionate force and that they're targeting civilians. And I had not studied the issue. I wasn't really paying that much attention to it, except to me, no, Israel is only defending itself because these people, Hezbollah, Hamas, all these organizations, they hate Jews and they hate Israel and they want to destroy that country. And so when someone would say, well, Israel's targeting civilians, I would say, no, 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 they're not targeting civilians. What's happening is they're trying to kill Hezbollah soldiers who are trying to kill them, and Hezbollah is embedding or has placed their missiles in populated civilian areas. I didn't know if that was true. I just made that up on the spot without even questioning myself about it. I found out later that human rights organizations who were in Lebanon at the time concluded that most of the missiles that Hezbollah had been firing were in open valleys and in unpopulated areas. But that argument that I made, anyone who pays attention to this issue has heard that argument. They've heard it with Hamas, they've heard it with Hezbollah. Israel's always saying, well, we're only trying to kill Hamas soldiers, like in the latest atrocity that happened in Gaza. We can't help it. They're embedding themselves in civilian populations. We're not trying to kill the civilians. We just want to kill the Hamas soldiers because we're defending ourselves. It's our security. But when I made that argument, I had never heard Israel say that. I made that argument out of my own mind. It was my internal logic that was part of my indoctrination, part of my Jewish indoctrination. And when I say indoctrination, I don't mean that I went to school and people were telling me, everybody hates the Jews, everybody hates the Jews, you know, the Palestinians are demons. You know, it wasn't like that. You would hear things like Israel's only defending itself. You would hear things in the 50s and early 60s like Gamal Nasser, the most charismatic leader in the Arab world, the leader of Egypt, was the Hitler of the Middle East. I heard that at synagogue. I didn't know that David Ben-Gurion used to call him that. David Ben-Gurion, instead of negotiating peace with Nasser, who tried numerous times to solve the problem, Ben-Gurion wouldn't even talk to him despite the pleadings of Ralph Bunche, who went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize, who was the UN mediator who succeeded the assassinated Folk Bernadotte, assassinated by Yitzhak Shamir, a future Israeli prime minister. I didn't know that Ben-Gurion had used that term as an alternative to making peace. And so if you grew up in the 1950s, anywhere in the world as a Jew, soon, less than a decade or 15 years after the Holocaust, when you hear that this guy is the Hitler of the Middle East, that becomes part of how you define yourself as a Jew, because you see, oh, well, the Arabs want to do what Hitler did. So you start developing this internal logic. And so I could never have understood this issue until I understood my own mind. And I didn't understand my own mind. I would have told you I did, but it wasn't until 2006 that I did understand my own mind and my limited presumed mortal identity. And so let me explain to you what happened, because that will also explain why I claim that identity is the root cause of the problem. It's primary to land, culture, or religion, and why identity is the veil of illusion that causes us to see the world in a way that is not compatible with the way the world is. Our identity and the beliefs and images that emanate from and reinforce that identity is the veil through which we see the world. So if we have a certain concept of how the world is supposed to be, if we see certain people, such as Arabs, as killers, as anti-Semites, as people who want to destroy our people, we are going to see the world in a certain way. We're going to notice some things. We're going to not notice other things that we probably should be noticing. We're going to interpret events in a certain way. We're going to see, as I forget who I told someone here, we're going to see the Palestinian Jesus. We're not going to see the love and the compassion. We're going to see that person as the enemy, because we've created a world of us against them. The world of us against them is derived out of the concept of self and other. We're born, we're told who we are, we're given an identity, and we buy it. And it's voluntary. We don't have to buy it, but probably 99.9999999% of all the people who've ever lived have bought it. There's a few who haven't. The Buddha, Jesus, Ramana Maharshi. There's a handful, right? But we buy it and we believe it, and then we keep believing it and we keep indoctrinating ourselves. And even through subtle feeling, through unspoken messages, through osmosis, we start absorbing the collective mind of our identity, of the people we have identified with. So in 2006, Hamas captured Shalit, and then Hezbollah invaded Israel. And this was horrifying to me because I took it personally. I took it personally because I thought they wanted to destroy the Jews, and I was a Jew. So I actually saw myself among the people being targeted. In other words, I had empathy for myself and for my people, but if it had been the same exact situation, but it was Englishmen wanting to target Irishmen, it wouldn't have been a big deal to me. I wouldn't have taken it personally, so I wouldn't have been scared. I wouldn't have been terrified. And the fear, which always accompanies identity, or I should say a separate identity, because in a world of self and other, right, the other is always the possible enemy. The other is what you don't understand. The other goes beyond the bounds of how you define yourself. So I was very upset, and I talked to my two smartest, wisest, most spiritually advanced friends, who I'd known for many years were always critical of Israel. And I thought this time, come on, this time they're going to agree with me, because after all, Hamas does this, Hezbollah started this. It was Hezbollah that invaded Israel, not the other way around. They're going to finally see the light. And I went to them, and they didn't see the light at all. They blamed Israel for doing what it always does. And that just incensed me. And it made me even more committed or attached to my identity, because it convinced me that if these two people, who are two of the wisest people I've ever known in my life, if they don't see it, then only the Jewish people can understand what's happening. Only Jews know what's really happening to us, right? And of course, it never occurred to me, well, what about the Palestinians? They're suffering a lot too. That never occurred to me. Because part of Israel's indoctrination, part of the Jewish community's indoctrination, the Jewish community that at least attaches itself to Israel and believes that Israel is the safe haven of the Jewish people, part of their internal logic, it doesn't even include Palestinians as people. They are the enemy. And if you have an enemy, the only way you can resolve a problem with an enemy is either to submit or somehow neutralize the enemy, right? And the only way you can neutralize an enemy is not to see it as a human being. You have to dehumanize them first. You're not going to kill people if you see them as human beings like yourself. So you first have to objectify and dehumanize them. So my friends disagreed with me, and that got me really angry. So then I went to a rally at the Jewish Community Center where in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, the Israeli Consul General to the United States in the Southwest, he came. Every rabbi in Albuquerque was there. The New Mexico head of the Anti-Defamation League was there, and the head of the New Mexico head of AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, was there. The entire kit and caboodle of Jewish society that wants to indoctrinate you and get you to believe a specific idea without any regard for any other point of view. They were all there, along with a bunch of Christians holding signs saying, you know, supporting Israel all the way, right? And that was unusual to me. I thought, oh, good, there's some good Christians. I didn't realize that they were part of the dehumanization apparatus. So I went to this, and I loved what the rabbi said, which was, it's all Hezbollah's fault, and they want to kill us. And then I went home, and then just a couple days later, and this was maybe a week into the hostilities, it was a little over 3 weeks, the Second Lebanon War. So this was about a third of the way through. I got a phone call, an unexpected phone call from my friend Sammy, who I went to nursery school with. And I was friendly with Sammy, but I didn't see him that much. He was in New Jersey, I was in New Mexico. But I knew that he had studied the Israel-Palestine issue quite a bit. But I didn't know, and I knew that he was sympathetic to the Palestinians, but he's so low-key and, didn't really, it wasn't like a rallying cry for him. It wasn't an issue that, he really didn't have issues that were burning in him. He wasn't particularly passionate. And so I never really heard his point of view that much. And as I say, he's fairly neutral. And so he calls me up to tell me he's going to be coming here to Denver to a bar mitzvah of a friend of ours who had actually played pro basketball in Israel for 8 years. And so Michael, who lives around here, his son was getting bar mitzvah, and Sammy says, and after the bar mitzvah, I'm going to come down to Albuquerque. I'm going to drive down, and I'm going to hang out with you for a little bit. I said, great, and by the way, the whole Arab world wants to kill all the Jews. And that was the first sentence of a 2-hour diatribe. And he listened, and he hardly said anything. Once in a while, he would interrupt, and he'd go, no, that's not true. Israel, it's the Litani River, the border between Israel and Lebanon. That's the issue for Israel. So every once in a while, he would just stop and disagree, but in a very neutral way. He wasn't at all judgmental. He wasn't stopping me. He wasn't blocking what I was saying. And he was pretty much, it was like, as I thought about after the conversation was over, it was as if he had created a space for me to just vent and to say what I wanted without any resistance. And then at the end, because he had given me no resistance, at the end of the diatribe, he goes, why don't you read a couple books? And I thought, and then he gave me the name of 2 Israeli scholars, Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt, both of whom were well-respected, very good Israeli scholars, both of whom actually died in 2008, the same year. Anyway, so I thought to myself, I've never read a book on this subject, other than From Time Immemorial by Joan Peters, which he had told, which I read in the mid-90s. Which was my Bible, by the way. It was a bestseller, and it was a thickly documented book in which she basically said that the Palestinian people didn't really exist. They were Arabs from other parts of the Arab world who had come to Israel for jobs from kind-hearted Israeli employers. That's what she said. And what made it convincing was that she had worked in the Deep South in the 1950s, and had reported on the plight of African Americans. And she claimed that her intention in going over to Israel and the West Bank was to report on the horrible living conditions of Palestinians in refugee camps. That was allegedly what she was doing. But when she got there, she found out that the refugee camps were pretty nice, you know? So, and I know I'm getting off track a little, but I want to tell you something. My mother is in a Jewish assisted living facility in New Jersey. And when I went to visit her there, probably within the first few weeks she was there, there was a bunch of books sitting on a table. And the people there who worked there said, oh, take those books, take whatever you want. Those books are for free. And I happened to see From Time Immemorial. And I didn't have the book. I had borrowed it when I read it 20 years ago. So I saw that book, and I didn't want to touch it, you know, but I thought, well, what the hell, maybe let me take a look at this. It's been 20 years. See if there was what it was that got me. Well, what got me was that she was telling me everything that I wanted to hear, that I didn't even know about, that I wanted to hear. Well, I took the book, and I opened it up, and in the first paragraph, it was so obvious that she was completely prejudiced and one-sided, and that her book had no neutrality at all. It was not honest reporting. It was not honest journalism. It was obvious. And I probably read the first couple chapters, and just to confirm that my initial impression was accurate, and it was accurate. And yet, 20 years earlier, I didn't even catch that at all. And I didn't catch it because I was reading something that told me what I wanted to hear, that was giving me ammunition that I could use to be right. Not for peace, not to establish or help work for peace, but to be right. That's what's really important, right? Because if you're right, you're reinforcing your identity, and that's what's really important, right? So anyway, so I get off the phone with Sammy, and I didn't want to buy any books, especially if they were going to be critical about me. So I went on Amazon and I looked up Baruch Kimmerling and I looked up Tanya Reinhardt and I wrote the names of their books down. And when you go on Amazon, as probably everybody here knows, Amazon suggests other books. So I looked at the authors' last names because I wasn't going to write down the name of an author or a book that wasn't written by a Jew, because I knew I wouldn't trust what I was reading if it was going to be critical, right? So I wrote down Norman Finkelstein and a few other authors. I didn't know who Finkelstein was at the time. So I went to my library and I had this list of books by Jewish authors on Israel-Palestine, and I started looking for these books. And I found one book by Baruch Kimmerling. The Albuquerque Library isn't so great. But I found one book by Baruch Kimmerling, and I found a book called Beyond Chutzpah by Norman Finkelstein. And I decided I'd check these two books out. And I looked at the book jacket of Finkelstein's book. Remember, I never heard of him before. And at the time, he was already very controversial. But I looked at the jacket and I see, oh my God, this guy is, he's going to take, he's criticizing Alan Dershowitz. And I had always liked Dershowitz. I thought Dershowitz was a brilliant lawyer, and he was someone who was very progressive on social issues and civil rights issues. And I thought, wow, you know, and he was very critical of the Supreme Court when they voted for Bush in Bush v. Gore, when Bush won that so-called election. So that was interesting. And then I read a little further and I saw that Finkelstein, and this reminded me of what Sammy had told me years before that I had completely put out of my mind because I didn't want to believe it. It mentions in the book jacket Joan Peters, that Finkelstein had completely debunked Joan Peters' worthless work. And that was my Bible at the time. That was the book I relied on. When someone would criticize Israel, I could cite from Joan Peters' book and tell them how wrong they were. So I thought, oh, this is really provocative. Now I'm stuck. I can't put this book back on the shelf because, you know, I got to at least have some integrity and see what he has to say. So I started reading his book. And by the way, the title Beyond Chutzpah, Finkelstein has a sense of humor. The reason he took the title Beyond Chutzpah, even though his book is not totally about Dershowitz, Dershowitz wrote a book called The Case for Israel, which is one of the stupidest titles you could ever imagine by a brilliant man, an allegedly brilliant man. I'll tell you why it's stupid in a minute. But the reason he used the term Beyond Chutzpah is because Dershowitz had written a book before The Case for Israel that was an autobiography called Chutzpah. And so Finkelstein is saying Dershowitz's book, The Case for Israel, is beyond chutzpah. It is total bullshit. It's a hoax. And the reason The Case for Israel is such a stupid title is because Dershowitz is a lawyer. And what he's saying is, I'm making my case for my client. And that means if I have to avoid the truth, if I have to distort it and make you think lies, that's what I'm going to do, because my job is to make the best case for my lawyer, for my client. And that is what he did. And anybody can debunk Dershowitz's book. I mean, he quoted one of his sources was a 9th grader in Illinois. Anyway, so I bring these books home, and I decide, okay, I've done enough for a day. I'm not going to start reading till tomorrow. So the next day, I picked up Beyond Chutzpah, and I started reading it. And I knew in the first paragraph, honestly, I knew that I was reading the work of a brilliant man. And again, I had never heard of Finkelstein. I'd never heard any criticism of him. And Sammy had actually alluded to Finkelstein years earlier, but not by name. When I was telling Sammy what a great book from time immemorial was, like in the late 90s, Sammy goes, well, Richie, that book was debunked by a Jewish scholar in New York. And I said, well, who? And he didn't have the name. And I thought, oh, the guy's probably just some lunatic. And that was the end of it. And I put it out of my mind. So I'm reading this book by Finkelstein. And aside from the fact that I knew right away he was a brilliant scholar, the documentation was meticulous. And everything he's saying is critical of Israel. There is not a single thing that is critical of the Palestinians. And I'm thinking to myself, you know, what's going on here? I mean, there's got to be something critical he can say about the Palestinians. Maybe he's one-sided. Maybe and the subtitle of the book was on the misuse of anti-Semitism. And I'm thinking, is he misusing anti-Semitism or am I misusing anti-Semitism? What's going on here? So I kept reading, and he's talking about collective punishment, totally destroying people's homes, Israel's use of lethal force, even in situations where there is no threat to the Israeli soldiers, Israel's use of lethal force against Palestinian children when there is no threat, Israel's theft of Palestinian land, and he's documenting all of this with mainstream, reputable human rights organizations like B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and other International Red Cross, well-known organizations, not some, unusual organization that maybe he had a certain connection to that just gave him the information he wanted. And I'm reading this, and as I'm reading this, I started going through these emotions, but I was so absorbed in what I was reading that I didn't stop and really identify the emotions. I didn't say, like the first emotion I probably went through was shock. Shock at what I was reading. I couldn't believe this was true of Israel. I didn't stop and say, oh, I'm shocked, but I kept reading. And then I got angry. And I got really angry at what I was reading. Israel's the only country in the world that legalizes political liquidation. Israel tortures practically every Palestinian male. And he had pictures, drawings of how they do it. Israel shook this guy to death. And then they denied that he died of shaking, but even the Israeli forensic pathologist admitted that he died of severe shaking. And so I'm reading this, I'm really angry at Israel, and then I got angry at myself because I realized I had bought all these lies all my life. I had bought all this bullshit all my life. And so I got angry at myself. Then after the anger at myself kind of receded, I felt embarrassed that I was 58 years old at the time. And I had never really paid attention, and I had simply gone along with Israel's propaganda and had basically ignored the suffering of the Palestinian people and bought into the belief that it was their fault, that the only reason there wasn't peace was because Palestinians refused to make peace. And then after the embarrassment, I felt shame. And then the shame turned to sorrow for the suffering of the Palestinian people, everything they'd gone through. Then I had to put the book down. I decided I needed to take a break. So I just put the book down, and I was just sitting there in a chair, and I closed my eyes. And I really don't know how long my eyes were closed. But when I opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed was there was no shock, there was no anger, there was no embarrassment, shame, sadness, sorrow. There was none of this. And I'm wondering, wow, that's pretty amazing. All of this stuff is gone, and I felt purified. And it was so dramatic. The change in my emotional state was so dramatic that I actually spontaneously looked around my room, looked in my bookcase, and I looked in the corners of the room looking for these emotions to see if I could find them. I mean, if someone said to you, you know, well, your emotion of anger is in that corner, and then you got shame over there, you know, you'd think they were a little bit crazy. But this was not out of thought. I wasn't thinking this. It just was a spontaneous movement in consciousness, you could say. And I thought that was really, really fascinating. And then I happened to notice that I couldn't find a Jewish identity. And I thought, that's really weird, because if I wasn't going to find a Jewish identity, if somehow a Jewish identity left me, I would have probably gone through all kinds of, to use the Jewish word, tsuris. I would have gone through all kinds of emotions and upheaval, and I would have thought. You know, it would have been quite a dramatic event, and yet there was nothing. I just couldn't find a Jewish identity. I didn't even notice that it had dissolved. Although in retrospect, I can say that in that space I went into when I closed my eyes, I went into nothingness. And in nothingness, anything can arise. Anything can happen, right? So then I tried to reanimate this Jewish identity that I could not find. And I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg, who was the young Jewish man who was beheaded by Al-Qaeda of Iraq in 2004, I think it was. And I remembered when that happened, and I was horrified, and I was scared. If he had not been a Jew, it wouldn't have been anywhere near as big a deal. But I could see myself in the shoes of Nick Berg, right? So I tried to imagine myself in that situation, and I imagined all little Jewish kids and little American kids being slaughtered by these Muslim fanatics. And I could not reanimate a Jewish identity, and I could not reanimate any terror towards these so-called extremists. And they are extremists. But what arose instead of fear was equanimity. And at that moment I knew that no matter how bloodthirsty these extremists were, they craved the same right to self-determination as did I. Their tactics to achieve their right to self-determination were rather insane. But the need for self-determination was really no different than mine. So then I felt, by the way, how much time do I have left? Just 2 minutes? Then I felt a cloth covering my eyes, as if it was in the shape of a rectangle. And all of a sudden, and I just sat there, and I was in a state of bliss. Actually, the moment my eyes opened, I was in a state of bliss, and I was in the present. There was no future, and there was no past. I was in the eternal present. So I noticed this cloth covering my eyes, and I just noticed it and felt pretty good. It wasn't pressing too hard. And all of a sudden, it started unraveling, and it unraveled in a spiral manner from left to right until it uncovered both eyes. And when that happened, the world was brighter, and I realized that the world is a projection of my inner states of consciousness. The world never changes. My states of consciousness change, and I project onto it. And then all kinds of insights arose. And I understood that our attachment to a limited, presumed mortal identity, any challenge to that is like a possibility of death. And this is why it is so hard for so many people to even look and to feel and to understand the gravity of what is happening. It is why, even though in the last maybe 20, probably more than 20 years, probably 25 years, there is so much information about this most documented event probably in human history, the Israel-Palestine problem. There is so much information that shows what is really going on, and now with YouTube and video, you know, all kinds of video, all kinds of information, people still can't look at it. They still defend Israel as only defending itself because it's of its security. They don't understand that when you steal a people's land and when you kill them because they resist, that you're not making yourself more secure. When you steal people's land, what do you expect people to do? If you want to be secure, make peace and make amends and admit to your crimes to start with. So, I mean, I could speak for hours about this, but I explained it in much greater detail in my book. But Anyway, so again, identity, that's the big deal. We have to inquire within and find out whether the beliefs and images we take for granted, whether there's any reality or truth to them. Thank you.